You are not alone. And GT, I know. I love you. And GT, she weighed 400 kg and her people called her a monster. They stripped her rank, burned her name from the records and sent her to die, alone on a rock at the edge of the galaxy. She survived for 3 years eating lichen and drinking condensation off cave walls. And then a human showed up. Not to rescue her, to hide. And everything changed. Her name was Vorkaen, and she was the largest female in the history of the Selhari people. A proud, slender species who measured worth in wingspan and waist diameter. She'd been their greatest warrior, their most decorated commander. And then one catastrophic growth cycle hit, and none of that mattered anymore. Her people looked at her size and saw weakness. They saw excess. They saw something that didn't belong. The human's name was Sergeant Daxakoy, formerly of the United Earth Marine Corps, currently listed as KIA, killed in action on 3 separate military databases, which was honestly impressive given that he was very much alive. He'd made some enemies, the powerful kind, and a quiet little exile suited him just fine. He thought he was alone out there. He was wrong. What you're about to hear is the full story. How a banished warrior and a presumed dead human soldier built something that would eventually terrify every major military power in the explored galaxy. How the thing her own people treated as a defect turned into the most devastating tactical advantage anyone had ever seen in 300 years of interstellar warfare. And how a species that had never heard the word compassion learned what it actually costs to use it. The planet didn't even have a name. It had a catalog number, DX7741. Gamma, a moon technically, orbiting a gas giant so old and cold it barely registered on thermal scans. The Selhari had picked it specifically because it was the kind of place that didn't appear on any shipping lane, any exploration manifest, or any map that anyone actually cared about. It was where you put things you wanted to forget. Vorkaen had been there for 1,012 days. When she first saw the drop pod, she knew what it was immediately. She'd spent 40 years commanding military vessels. She recognized the scorched ceramic shell, the blown stabilizer fins, the way it came in too hot and hit the ground like something thrown in anger, rather than launched with purpose. She watched from the ridge above her cave system, absolutely motionless despite the weight of her own body pressing into the stone beneath her, and she calculated 17 different scenarios in the span of about 4 seconds. 11 of them ended with her dead. The other 6 were interesting. She hadn't made commander of the 3rd Selhari Expeditionary Fleet by being reckless. She'd made it by being the most dangerous thing in any room she entered. And she intended to stay that way even on a moon that no one cared about. Watching a pod that might contain a threat or might contain an opportunity, and being smart enough to understand the difference. The pod's hatch blew off with a hiss of compressed atmosphere. A figure tumbled out. Bipedal, compact, covered in a torn tactical suit that had seen better decades. He hit the ground, rolled, came up with a sidearm already drawn, swept a 180, apparently decided there was nothing immediately trying to kill him, and then sat down heavily on a rock and said something in a language she didn't Have loaded. She ran it through her memory archive. Anyway, it matched a partial catalog from intelligence brief she'd read 11 years ago during the Terran contact assessment. The sound was something like, "Well, this is just fantastic." She almost smiled. Almost. She spent the next 4 days watching him. He was methodical. She'd give him that. He scavenged what he could from the wreck, prioritized shelter over food, found water before he needed it, and set up 3 overlapping proximity alarm systems using parts from the pod's navigation array. Smart, efficient, experienced. The kind of movements that came from someone who had been in bad situations before and had developed opinions about how to survive them. But he was struggling with the cold. The planet's temperature dropped to -40 during the dark cycle, and his suit's thermal systems were on backup power at best. She could see the way he moved during those periods. Stiff, deliberate, conserving heat. He was burning through his food reserves faster than he'd planned because his body was working overtime just to stay functional. He had maybe 3 weeks before the stopped working in his favor. Vorkane had been warm the entire time. Not because the moon was comfortable, it wasn't, but because 400 kg of Selhari musculature generated a truly extraordinary amount of metabolic heat, and the very thing her people had mocked and eventually exiled her for was, it turned out, excellent insulation. She thought about it for 2 more days. Then she made a decision. She stepped out of the shadows on the 8th day, and the human did exactly what she expected him to do. He raised the weapon, assessed, and didn't fire. Most species fired. Humans looked first. That detail mattered more than he would ever know. She stood at the entrance to his makeshift shelter, and she knew, an arresting sight. The Selhari were tall by most standards. The average adult stood about 2 and 1/2 m, but Vorkane stood clear as throat, 3 m in change, and she was broad in a way that no other living Selhari was. Her people's aesthetic ideal was elongated, narrow, almost architectural. She looked like something built for a different purpose. She held up both hands, palms forward. Universal. She'd read that in the Terran contact assessment too. The human kept the weapon up for 4 full seconds. She counted. Then he lowered it slowly and said something. The translator she'd built from her crashed shuttle's components, 14 months of careful work in the cave, was already cycling. It caught most of it, he'd said. "You've been watching me, haven't you?" "For days," she said in her own language, knowing the device would handle the conversion with a small delay. 8 days. You set your proximity alarms wrong. They cover the approaches from the lowlands, not the ridge. He looked up at the ridge, looked back at her. Something moved in his face that she would later come to recognize as the specific expression humans made when they were simultaneously embarrassed and impressed and trying very hard not to show either. "Right," he said. "I'm Dax." "I know what you are," she said. "You're a Terran, military by your movements, exiled by your presence here, possibly dead officially. All 3, actually." He hoisted the weapon. "And you, Vorkane, formerly Commander 3rd Expeditionary Fleet, Selhari Sovereignty." She paused. Also exiled. Also possibly dead officially. He looked at her for a long moment, then he gestured at the shelter. I've got something that passes for heated ration packs. You want one? She didn't need them. Her metabolic reserves were substantial. But she recognized an offering when she heard one, and she understood that accepting it would establish something important about the nature of what this was going to be. Yes, she said. Thank you. They ate in silence, which was fine. She'd learned that silence didn't need to be filled. Her people had never understood that. They were a species that experienced quiet as a kind of aggression, as if the absence of communication was an accusation. Humans, apparently, were comfortable just existing in the same space without narrating it. After a while, Dax said, "How long have you been here?" 1,020 days, she said. 3 years. He processed that. Alone. Completely. He didn't say he was sorry. She appreciated that. Sorry was what you said when something could have been different. This had been what it was. What happened? He asked instead. And that was a better question. She told him. Not everything, not yet. But the shape of it. The growth cycle, which had hit her in her 38th year far later and more severely than it ever had for any recorded Selhari. The medical officers who'd classified her condition as a degenerative anomaly. The council vote. The ceremony where they stripped her rank and said words she still kept in a precise and untouched corner of her memory for reasons she hadn't entirely examined. Dax listened. Didn't interrupt. Didn't offer perspective or comparison or comfort. Just listened. Which was, she was beginning to understand, a particular human skill that they didn't seem to know was rare. When she finished, he said, "Your people exiled you because you got too big. Because I became something they didn't have a framework for." She said, "The Selhari are precise. Everything has a correct form. I stopped having a correct form. That's insane." He said quietly, not angry, just stating it as a fact, the way you'd note that a navigational calculation had come up wrong. "What happened to you?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I found out my commanding officer was selling targeting data to a separatist faction. Civilians were dying. I reported it. He had more friends than I did." A pause. 3 separate death certificates. "I'm very officially not a problem anymore." "And yet," she said. "And yet," he agreed. Here's what neither of them said that night. That they'd each been thrown away by people who were supposed to know their worth. That the things that had gotten them, exiled her size, his conscience, were the exact things that were about to make them extraordinary. Some things you don't say. Some things you just start doing. They didn't make any speeches about partnership. They didn't declare an alliance or shake hands over a shared goal. What they did was more practical and probably more lasting. They solved each other's immediate problems. Dax's problem was thermal. The planet's dark cycles were going to kill him by the end of the next moon month. Vorakane's cave system held warmth because of the geothermal vents deeper in the rock, but she'd never had reason to make the entrance comfortable for anything human-sized. They spent the first 3 days modifying her setup, lowering certain passages that had been built to her dimensions, creating a warm air channel from the vent system into the forward cave, insulating the sleeping area. He was practical with tools in a way she admired. She was strong in a way that made his calculations meaningless about what was movable and what wasn't. Her problem was loneliness, though she hadn't named it that until he arrived. She told herself she was simply operating at reduced efficiency due to lack of external stimulation. The data of his presence, the noise of another living thing, the small stupid conversations, the entirely unnecessary commentary he provided on everything he was doing, as if narrating his own existence, corrected something in her that she hadn't realized was skewed. They talked endlessly. Eventually, she had 40 years of command history and tactical analysis, and he had 10 years of combat deployments across 6 different planetary theaters, and the overlap in their expertise was, it turned out, enormous. They disagreed frequently. Both of them were used to being right. It made the conversations extremely loud, sometimes, and extremely productive. Always, he taught her human tactical doctrine. She taught him Selhari fleet maneuvering. He explained Earth's various wars with the kind of weary familiarity of someone who'd studied them as cautionary tales, and then ended up in several of them. Anyway, she explained the 3 major Selhari military campaigns she'd personally commanded, including the one where she'd won significant engagement by predicting that the enemy would do the logical thing and positioning her forces to punish them for it. You think in patterns, he observed one evening, 3 weeks into their cohabitation. Everyone thinks in patterns, she said. No, he said. Some people think in variables. You think in patterns first, then you look for the variable that breaks the pattern, and that's what you plan for. She considered this. Is that not what military strategy is? It's what good military strategy is. He said, most people plan for the pattern, you plan for the exception. He looked at her across the fire they'd gotten working from salvaged heating elements. That's rare. She felt something she didn't immediately have a word for. It took her several hours of reflection to identify it. It was the feeling of being seen accurately, of being assessed by someone paying close attention and having them arrive at a correct conclusion. She had experienced positive assessments before: commendations, medals, formal recognition. But those had been about her performance. This was about how her mind worked. The difference was significant. You think in what I would call cascades, she told him, because fairness demanded reciprocation. You identify a single weak point and you extrapolate every potential consequence of striking it. Some of them seem unrelated to the original target. That's chaos theory applied to. I know what chaos theory is, she said. I'm saying it's a gift. I'm saying not everyone can hold that many variables simultaneously without losing the thread. He was quiet then. My commanding officer used to tell me I thought too much. Your commanding officer was selling, targeting data to people who killed civilians, she said. His opinions are not useful. Something shifted in Dax's expression in a way she couldn't quite read yet. She filed it away. She was learning to read humans the way She'd always learned new intelligence systems methodically with patience, noting which inputs produced which outputs. What they built during those first months wasn't a plan. It was a capability. It started because they needed something to do, and they had parts. His pods remains her shuttles. Wreckage via salvage sheet. Accumulated over 3 years. They started combining things. He knew Earth engineering principles. She knew Selhari resonance physics, which operated on entirely different assumptions about what matter was for. The things they built with both were strange, novel, occasionally alarming. The first was a sensor array. Dax's proximity systems had been basic. Her shuttle had carried more sophisticated passive scanning, equipment damaged but recoverable. They rebuilt it using a hybrid architecture that shouldn't have worked, according to either system's operating manual, and worked beautifully in practice. It could detect ships in the upper atmosphere before the ships could detect a surface signal. The second was a communications relay. Dark spectrum, frequency hopping, designed to look like background radiation. Dax had ideas about who he could trust. In the UAMC, people who'd been watching what had happened to him and had been too smart to say anything at the time. Vorakane had nothing left in the Selhari command structure, but she had information. 14 months of close observation from positions of command that certain parties in the neutral territories would find extraordinarily valuable. "You're thinking about going back," he said one afternoon. "I'm thinking about what would need to be true in order for going back to be worthwhile," she said. "There's a difference." He nodded slowly. "What would need to be true?" She looked at him. 3 months of daily interaction had given her a solid working model of how he processed information. She made a decision. "I would need to have something they want badly enough to require negotiating from their strength, not mine." "You have tactical expertise," he said. 40 years of it." "They have tactical officers," she said. "I'd need something they don't have. Something like the capability to do what nobody else can do." She paused. "Something that proves the thing they exiled me for is actually an asset." "Meaning you'd need to prove the thing they exiled you for is actually an asset?" "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment. Then slowly, a particular expression spread across his face. She'd seen it before, but only when he was working through something that excited him. A looser, more animated quality to his features, like a system coming online. "Tell me something," he said. "In standard gravity, how much force can you generate at full effort?" She calculated. "With my current musculature in 0.8 standard gravity like this moon, approximately 900 kN. In standard gravity, slightly less." He stared at her. "Is that significant?" she asked. "Vora," he said. He'd started shortening her name 3 weeks in, and she'd let him, which still surprised her occasionally. A military-grade blast door is rated to about 400 kN. She processed that then. "Oh." "Yeah," he said. "Oh." They spent the next 6 months figuring out exactly how catastrophically useful she was. And the answer, it turned out, was very. But capability without direction is just a very large problem waiting to happen. What they needed was a reason to aim it. The galaxy was about to provide one. The signal came 14 months after Dax landed on DX 7741 Gamma. It came through the dark spectrum relay, encrypted with a key he'd given exactly one person, a woman named Lieutenant Commander Fenn Addisa, who had been his most reliable intelligence contact before his death. Became official. The message was 11 words long. It said, "Your old co is running the Cygnus Station Weapons Program. Civilians again." Dax showed Vorakane the message. She read it once. "How many civilians?" she asked. "The Cygnus Station program involves weapons testing on populated colony worlds," he said. His voice was very flat. That extreme flatness in his voice meant extreme internal agitation. Estimated exposure: 14,000 people over the next 2 test cycles. She was quiet for a moment, then, "What do you want to do?" "I want to stop it," he said. "I want to stop him, and I want there to be consequences that actually hold." He looked at her. "What I need is help. Tell me about Cygnus Station," she said. He told her. It was a converted mining platform in the outer Cygnus system, now operated as a classified research installation under the command of one Colonel Harrison Marsh, who was apparently extremely good at staying officially clean while doing extraordinarily dirty things. The station had military-grade security, dedicated patrol ships and blast doors. Rated, she noted this, to 400 kilonewtons. "I need you to understand something," he said when he finished. "If we do this, it's not quiet. We'll be visible. People will know we're alive. The people who exiled us will know," she said. Yes. She thought about the council, the ceremony, the words they'd said. She held them in the precise, untouched corner of her memory, and she looked at them very directly for the first time in over a year. "Good," she said. "They spent 3 months planning it." It was, Vorakane reflected later, the most intellectually engaged she'd been since she'd lost her command, maybe ever, because she'd never before had a planning partner who thought the way Dax thought, who would take her patterns and find the exception in them and hand it back to her as a gift. They argued every step, changed the plan 14 times, built specialized equipment in the cave, using components they'd been accumulating, and a fabrication rig that was Dax's design and her muscle, and worked remarkably well. The core of the plan was simple, which is the sign of a good plan. Dax would infiltrate the station's communications hub using credentials that Fenn Addisa would provide, credentials that would hold for exactly 4 hours before the security system ran its next authentication cycle. During those 4 hours, he needed to copy the entire Cygnus program database, personnel, methods, locations, funding, sources, everything. That data transmitted to specific journalists at specific outlets in 3 different jurisdictions would be legally, politically, and physically impossible to suppress. The complication was that the database was behind 7 security doors and a human analyst team who would notice an unauthorized access attempt within minutes. The complication to the complication was that the analyst team was housed in a section of the station that was only accessible through a maintenance corridor, and the maintenance corridor was sealed with blast doors that Vorakane had already done the math on. There was also the matter of the 6-ship patrol around the station, which she'd been running tactical simulations on for 3 months and had a solution for, though Dax had called it absolutely unhinged when she explained it, which she'd taken as encouragement. They arrived in a salvaged cargo hauler that Finn Adisa had arranged, broadcasting a legitimate freight identifier. The patrol let them dock. Dax walked aboard with the credentials. Vorakane stayed in the ship for exactly 40 minutes, which is how long it took for the internal security sensors to determine that the cargo in Bay 3 was not, in fact, industrial equipment. When they opened the bay doors, she was ready. She'd spent considerable time in the cave, working with Dax on something he called tactical psychology. The principle was that a combatant entering a space created an immediate crisis response calculation in everyone who saw them, a threat assessment that ran in the first half-second and set the parameters for everything that followed. He'd explained how human special operations use this deliberately. Controlled appearance, deliberate noise, specific movements calibrated to cause specific reactions. She'd applied the same thinking to her own parameters. She stepped out of the cargo bay at her full height, which was 3 m and change, moving at the pace she reserved for when covering ground fast was important. She weighed 400 kg, and every single gram of it was in motion. The security team in the corridor had been briefed on threats. They had been briefed on essentially other humans. They had not been briefed on this. She went through the first security door because she was moving too fast for the lock to engage in time. She went through the second one because she hit it with 900 kN in 0.9 standard gravity, and the door's engineering specifications had not anticipated scenario in which someone simply didn't accept that it was closed. The analysts were evacuating. She let them. She wasn't there for the analysts. Dax was at the communications hub on the other side of the station. She knew his timeline. She had 5 doors left in 17 minutes. And she was, for the first time in over a year, precisely, completely, exactly what she was. Not an anomaly. Not an excess. Not a problem. A weapon, which is what she'd spent 40 years becoming. And a weapon with a purpose, which was the only thing that made any of it mean something. She broke down doors. She moved through sections of a military installation like something the installation's designers had not modeled. She generated, without any external equipment or augmentation, forces that should have required a vehicle. The cell H. Hari had exiled her for being too big, and the cell H. Hari had been wrong, and she was demonstrating that now in the most concrete and immediate way available. Dax got the database. He transmitted it in the final 6 minutes, before the credentials expired, to 19 different destinations simultaneously, and the data was in the hands of journalists, legal advocates, and military oversight committees before anyone on Cygnus Station had fully processed what had just happened. They were off the station in the cargo hauler before the patrol ships could coordinate a response, and they made the jump point with, as Dax put it, an amount of margin that he was choosing to call comfortable, and she was choosing to call sufficient. In the jump corridor, in the small cargo hauler that smelled like machine lubricant and the particular variety of instant coffee Dax had somehow acquired before they left. She asked him, "What happens now?" He thought about it. "The data breaks public in about 18 hours. Marsh is finished. The program is finished." He paused. "We're visible. We're officially alive. People are going to want to talk to us." "Both your people and mine," she said. "Yeah." He looked at her. "How do you feel about that?" She thought about the council, the ceremony, the words. She thought about the first security door, which had failed to stop her. She thought about Dax's face when he'd learned how much force she could generate, the specific expression of someone revising all of their working assumptions simultaneously and finding the revision better than the original. "I feel," she said, "that they should perhaps consider that their working assumptions about me require revision." He laughed. It was, she'd long since determined, a very good sound. The data broke in 17 hours. The story was everywhere within 48. 14,000 colonists were evacuated before the second test cycle. Marsh was arrested. The Selhari sovereignty received a formal diplomatic inquiry about the whereabouts of one Vorakane, formerly commander, 3rd Expeditionary Fleet, and what their intentions toward her were. The inquiry came from 4 separate human governments simultaneously. The sovereignty's response was, by their own admission, extremely careful. Vorakane received 3 separate offers of commission in human military forces within 2 months of Cygna Station. She declined all of them, not because she wasn't interested, but because she had terms, and her terms were specific. She would work with, not for. She would plan jointly, not receive orders from a structure that couldn't understand her capabilities. She would bring Dax, who was technically still listed as KIA on 3 military databases, and those databases would be corrected. All 3 governments agreed. They didn't have much choice. The woman who'd walked through blast doors had their attention. The Selhari sovereignty conducted formal review of her exile. It took 8 months, and the word that came back was, she reflected, extremely carefully worded. They didn't quite apologize. They offered reinstatement, which she declined. They offered something called a sovereignty consultation contract, which meant she could advise them without being technically bound to their command structure, and she accepted that because it gave her a platform and cost her nothing she wasn't willing to give. Dax's old commanding officer, Colonel Harrison Marsh, received a sentence that all 19 journalists covering the story agreed was inadequate, and all the oversight committees agreed was the maximum achievable under current statute. This was a disappointment that Dax processed visibly, and then set aside with the particular efficiency of someone who decided the future was more useful than the past. They kept working together. They built a reputation that wasn't quite military, wasn't quite diplomatic, occupied a space that hadn't had a name before they arrived in it. They were very good at going places that were difficult and getting things that were locked away and making situations that seemed impossible become instead merely expensive in ways that the right people were willing to pay. What I want you to take away from this story isn't the action. The action is satisfying, sure, blast. Doors are very dramatically breakable when you have the right tool. But that's not what matters here. What matters is what happened in that cave on a moon with no name. During 14 months of two exiled people, deciding to understand each other rather than tolerate each other. Vorakane spent 3 years believing her people were right about her. Not consciously, she'd never have admitted it, but in the quiet operational logic of her daily choices, she'd structured her existence around smallness, around taking up as little space as possible, around moving carefully and being contained. It took a human showing up with no preconceptions about what she was supposed to be, and simply observing what she was to correct that. Dax had spent 2 years believing that being right was a character flaw if it made enough people uncomfortable. He'd learned expensively that systems prefer compliance to accuracy. It took spending 14 months with a being who had no stake in his compliance and every interest in his accuracy to correct that. 2 exiles, a moon, a lot of time, and then everything else. Clear's throat. The galaxy has a habit of taking things it can't categorize and putting them somewhere out of sight. It's a very old habit, and it comes from a very understandable place. Categorization is how you man it. Complexity and things that don't fit categories feel like complexity you can't manage. The problem is that the things that don't fit categories are usually the things that break the constraints the categories were built around. You can exile an exception. You can't exile what an exception can do. You just end up somewhere on the other side of a blast door revising your assumptions. Vorakane was banished for her size, and her size in the end was exactly what she was always going to be known for, just not in the way anyone expected. If this story hit something for you, that specific feeling of watching someone get everything right about a person that their own people got wrong, there's more where this came from. There's a story about a Selhari pilot who lands in a human colony and discovers that human children have absolutely no sense of self-preservation and treat her like a jungle gym. There's a story about the diplomatic conference where Vorakane and Dax walk in together for the first time, and the room has to completely recalibrate everything it thought it knew. And there's a story about what happens 3 years later when the moon DX7741 Gamma ends up on an exploration manifest after all, and someone goes to investigate and finds the cave. Don't miss those. You know what to do.